Chapter 9, Napoleon brings back the army on the Seine. Action of RC from the 16th to the 21st of March. Napoleon, in the perusal of his dispatches, discovered some documents which enabled him to take a view of the state of things around him. In the north, General Maison continued to maneuver between Tournai, Lille, and Courtrai and kept the enemy in check. General Carnot remained master of the country of Antwerp and kept the English at a distance. The latter, after having failed in a bombardment principally directed against our fleet, had just experienced a more sanguinary reverse. Their General Graham maintained a correspondence in Bergen op Zoom in the night between the 8th and 9th of March. His troops surprised the entrance of one of the gates. 4,000 English penetrated into the place of which they thought themselves masters, but the danger which threatened the garrison was turned against themselves by General Pisonet's presence of mind. He rallied his troops, marched against the English, surprised them in the confusion of the night, drove them from street to street, and forced them back against the gates which were closed against them. All those who entered the town were killed or taken prisoners. Bayard could not have conducted himself better. The horizon was darkened on the side of Lyon. The Duke de Castiglione, instead of ascending the Saône and boldly marching on Vesoul, amused himself in a petty warfare with General Bubna, whom he shut up in Geneva. But while his headquarters were at Lons-le-Saunier, Generals Hesse-Homburg and Bianchi, detached from the Grand Austrian army, were proceeding by forced marches on Dijon for the purpose of occupying the roads of the Saône and preserving the Allies from the most dangerous diversion they had to apprehend. Augereau was surprised and compelled to make a countermarch against them. On the 7th of March, he abandoned the country of Gex and Franche-Comté. His delusion respecting Bubna, whom he had looked upon as his only enemy, was at an end, but it was too late. He had lost the opportunity of saving France. His efforts were then limited to the covering of Lyon, and he no longer had from that moment any weight in the balance of the great events of the campaign. Napoleon determined to replace Augereau by a more active and enterprising officer. He first thought of his brother Jerome, but a general who enjoyed popularity was requisite to inspire the troops with confidence, and he ultimately fixed his choice upon Marshal Suchet. At the foot of the Pyrenees, everything announced on the part of the army and its commander a loyalty which seemed to defy misfortune. Marshal Soult, after having kept in check for nearly 2 months the whole of Wellington's forces before Bayonne, was compelled to abandon the line of the Adour on the 27th of February. In consequence of the loss of the Battle of Orthez, he effected his retreat in admirable order upon Toulouse, and had just revenged himself on the 2nd of March by cutting to pieces in the action at Tarbes the Portuguese troops of General Acosta. But that gallant army was weakened by the frequent reinforcements which it sent to Paris. Bayonne was accordingly abandoned to its own strength, and the way to Bordeaux was thrown open. Fears were again entertained for the safety of Paris. The Dukes de Tarento and Reggio, unable to preserve Troyes, evacuated it. On the 4th of March, they afterwards attempted to stop the enemy at the passage of the Seine at Nogent, but they stated in their dispatches that Schwarzenberg's army was advancing with confidence, and they foresaw that they were on the point of being forced to continue their retreat. The enemy's progress by so many different routes began to give consistency to the hopes of the House of Bourbon. The Duc d'Angoulême had extended his correspondence as far as Bordeaux and throughout the south of France. Monsieur le Comte d'Artois had shown himself in Franche-Comté and Burgundy. His agents were recognized in Paris, and the friends of the imperial dynasty were alarmed. Prince Joseph, with the view of averting the storm, had run the risk of advising the Empress to write secretly to her father, but that princess refused to lend herself to the measure without Napoleon's approbation. Prince Joseph's attempt was of itself enough to make Napoleon sensible of the anxiety which prevailed. Determined to make head against the enemy, he had no longer any time to lose. He wished to strike a decisive blow, and he could not accomplish it without risking all for all. The safety of Paris necessarily became his first consideration. The enemy might be there on the 20th. It was therefore against Schwarzenberg that his march was to be directed, but he stood in need of some signal advantage, and that could not be obtained by an attack in front. The French army was then too weak, and it was in the rear that he ought to attack the Austrians. That maneuver held out the chance of throwing the enemy's rear guard into confusion, of making important captures, of deranging the combinations for the principal attack, and placing the Allied sovereigns in the heart of France, in a position calculated to inspire them with serious apprehensions. At worst, our retreat could always be effected upon the garrisons of Lorraine. It was supposed that Schwarzenberg had arrived at Nogent in order to debouch on the back of the enemy. The French army was to proceed on Epernay, Fère-Champenoise, and Marie. The corps of the Prince of the Muscova, which it had been under consideration to employ in Lorraine as partisans, was to suspend the execution of that plan and to take part in the efforts which the whole of our combined forces were once more about to risk. That corps d'armée was to follow the grand route from Chalon to Troyes and gain the Albe. The rendezvous was fixed on the banks of that river, but during the movement Paris would be uncovered. Blücher had already pushed on his detachments to Compiègne. Were the Empress and the King of Rome to run the risk of being shut up in the capital? In the power of our internal and external enemies, Napoleon was desirous above all other considerations of securing the liberty of his wife and son. He ordered Prince Joseph to send them up from Paris on the slightest appearance of danger, with the ministers to the Loire. All these dispositions having been made, the army commenced its march on the morning of the 17th. The corps d'armée of the Duke de Ragusa was alone left at Reims. He was to cooperate with the Duke de Treviso in defending the road to the capital foot by foot against the masses of Prussians, Russians, and Swedes that were about to break in upon it. Napoleon arrived at Epernay at an early hour. He alighted at the house of Monsieur Motte, the mayor of the town. He there learned the events of Bordeaux. The English had entered that city. They had been invited by the mayor himself, the Count de Lynch. The proposals made by that mayor at first surprised enemy, who hesitated to confide in them. The newspapers still resounded with his protestations of loyalty to Napoleon, and Wellington did him the honor to apprehend a snare from his double-dealing. But the Duc d'Angoulême had been completely satisfied in that respect by the missions of Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld, who was for some days employed in the interchange of communications between the prince and Bordeaux. Wellington, yielding to the solicitations of the Duc d'Angoulême, had accordingly consented to detach General Beresford's division to give to the partisans the House of Bourbon the support which they required, and the instant the latter saw themselves protected by the English bayonets, they proclaimed Louis XVIII. The event took place on the 12th of March. The Duc d'Angoulême was expected at Bordeaux to make his entrance into that city.